The air inside the bank thickened the moment he appeared, calm on the surface, but carrying a weight unseen by those who glanced his way. A black teenager with nothing but a folder, moving through a world that wasn't ready for him. What unfolded next was more than routine service. It was a collision with deep-rooted prejudice, silent judgments sharp enough to cut. No one realized he was more than a customer, more than a name on an ID. Soon, the quiet unfolding of dismissal and disdain would crack open a storm that no one in that polished lobby could ignore. This isn't just a story. It's a challenge to every system built on silence and inequality. If you want to see the truth unravel, like, subscribe, and tell us where you're watching from. Join the conversation. The glass doors to Nova Bank's downtown branch slid open with a soft hydraulic hiss, letting in the late morning light and the silent steps of Kian Maddox. 17 years old, tall for his age, but wiry. His hoodie zipped up halfway over a neatly ironed collared shirt. He carried a dark backpack slung tight across his shoulders. His sneakers were worn but clean, his hair neat, his expression focused. He walked with care, not because he was unsure of where he was going, but because he knew how easily a black teenager with purpose could be mistaken for a threat. The bank's lobby was sterile in that pristine corporate way, cold tile underfoot, white granite counters, faint jazz piped through ceiling speakers. Several customers sat scattered in muted chairs near the windows, eyes locked on their phones or the glowing TV screen mounted on the far wall. Kian stepped into the short queue for the service counter, scanning for a nameplate that matched the instructions he'd been given. Then he saw her, Brielle, blonde, early 40s, her makeup exact, her expression already hardening before he took another step. She looked him over from hood to shoes, then leaned toward the teller beside her, Wendell, and murmured something that made both of them smile. Not a kind smile. Wendell didn't even try to be discreet as he glanced at Kian and shook his head. Their private joke was public enough for the man 2 spots behind Kian to shift uncomfortably, and for the woman in front to glance over her shoulder with a hint of suspicion in her eyes. Kian stood still, hands visible, ID in hand already. He stepped forward when the red light above Brielle's station blinked green. Just as he moved, one of the floor staff, not even a teller, pushed a swivel chair out from a desk into the middle of the aisle, right in Kian's path. The move was casual but deliberate. Kian paused, stepped around the chair, and resumed walking, his face unreadable. He stopped at the counter, nodded politely. "Good morning. I'm here to assist with verification on an account. I need to speak to your branch operations officer or submit these papers for formal processing." He didn't speak loudly. He didn't rush. Every syllable had weight because he knew they'd be listening for something to fault. Brielle stared at him, not at the documents in his hand, not at the ID, at him. Her eyes narrowed as she leaned back in her chair like she was observing a stain on glass. "You have an appointment?" she asked, already reaching for a red stamp labeled rejected. "Yes. I was asked to verify," Kian started. "What's your name?" she interrupted, cutting through his words like they didn't matter. "Kian Maddox." She typed slowly, dramatically, as if every letter was suspect. When the screen lit up, she didn't blink. Instead, she reached forward. "I'll need ID," she said. Kian offered it. An official federal oversight ID, sleek, laminated, with an embedded chip. Brielle picked it up and held it like it might crumble. She tilted it under the desk lamp, then raised her brows, exaggerated. "Really?" she said out loud. Wendell leaned closer, eyes squinting at the badge, then laughed under his breath. "Looks like someone's got a future in Photoshop." Kian didn't reply. He'd heard worse. He stood straighter, fists relaxed, palms visible. Brielle turned the card sideways, as if trying to detect a secret watermark. "We don't validate joke IDs here," she said, louder this time. Kian opened his mouth to explain again, but Wendell chimed in. "Hey, maybe he's doing a school project. Or playing spy. Y'all do school role play now." More chuckles, louder. The red digits kept changing, and every time they did, the sinking pressure in his chest grew heavier. He was invisible now, or at least being treated as such. After Brielle's dismissal, Wendell had reopened his own booth, waving in a new customer and smiling brightly like nothing had happened. And yet, even as he handled that transaction, Kian caught the occasional glance in his direction, not just from Wendell, but from other staff as well. Each look carried a knowing flicker, a smirk, a slight roll of the eyes, like they were all silently in on the same joke. The kid on the bench doesn't matter. But Kian wasn't just any kid. He was there for a reason, a real one, with authorization and purpose, backed by layers of protocol and federal oversight that these people clearly didn't respect, or worse, didn't fear. His mind ticked through his checklist, mentally comparing how this branch's behavior matched the red flags listed in his training packet. Unprofessional treatment of clients, improper handling of credentials, targeted neglect, possible systems manipulation. But thinking like an auditor didn't ease the sting of how personal it all felt. Because it wasn't just professional misconduct now, it was personal humiliation, intentional, cruel, and designed to reduce him to someone who'd eventually just walk out, give up, disappear without disruption. But Kian didn't leave. He sat still, eyes on the screen, forcing himself to wait even though the game was obvious. The digital numbers blinked again. Now serving 731. He wasn't even being skipped in sequence anymore. They'd rewritten the order entirely. He stood slowly, approached the check-in kiosk, and tapped the touchscreen. It chirped back at him. "You have already been called. Please wait." He tried again. Same result. When he turned around, a young associate standing by the lobby printer gave him a long, dismissive glance and shook his head slowly, like Kian was the problem. Kian didn't respond. Instead, he returned to his seat and reached into his backpack for the prepared forms, bank account identifiers, routing verification, a confirmation memo with the federal emblem at the header. He reviewed each one again, even though he'd reviewed them the night before, and again that morning, triple-checked by the audit board director herself. These weren't mistakes. He wasn't fumbling. The problem wasn't his papers. The problem was the people. After 13 more minutes of sitting idle, his patience thinning but still intact, the customer service bell rang again, and Wendell called out from across the room with false cheer. "Hey, big man, you still here? You trying to camp out?" A few customers turned to look. Kian stood without answering and walked to the counter, the same counter where he'd just been humiliated. Wendell tapped a laminated form on the desk, leaned in, and said in a tone meant to sound friendly but reeked of mockery, "Why don't we try this again? You got your form, right? Looks like you smudged the print a little." Kian looked down. The page was clean, crisp, perfect. Still, he said nothing as Wendell plucked it from his hand, squinted, and shook his head. "Nope. Sorry, buddy. Can't process this. Ink's light. Can't accept forms we can't verify. Security, you know." Then, with theatrical flair, Wendell tore the document down the middle, then again across the halves, letting the shreds fall in slow motion to the tiled floor. Kian didn't move. The sound of tearing echoed unnaturally loud in the deadened space of the lobby. Brielle at the next counter turned to see what was happening and let out a low snort. Someone in line muttered something unintelligible but derisive. Wendell handed Kian a fresh blank copy from under the counter, slapped it onto a clipboard, and shoved it across the glass with a pen that had secure transactions printed in cheap blue font. "Here, let's try it again. Real careful this time, huh?" Kian took the clipboard with a controlled hand, his fingers brushing a small wet smear near the edge, coffee, or something more intentional. He didn't flinch, didn't give them the satisfaction. He walked back to his bench, sat down, and began rewriting every word on the form in the same perfect handwriting he'd used the first time. He made sure it was bolder, darker. Then he triple-checked it before standing again, returning to the counter. From the corner of Kian's vision, the security guard, Kieran, had returned to his usual post, arms folded, eyes steady, mouth unreadable. But it was clear now that his job wasn't to ensure safety. It was to serve as silent intimidation, a constant looming presence designed to remind Kian what could happen if he said the wrong word or stood a little too tall. Then came the voice. It rang out across the lobby with sudden, cutting clarity, amplified through the internal sound system like a breaking news announcement. "Attention staff, please be advised of a possible counterfeit identification used at Counter 3. Security may respond accordingly. Every head in the room turned. The customers at the waiting area sat up straighter. Conversations hushed. Some eyes went directly to Kian. Others glanced toward the counter before slowly sliding toward the teen, now standing perfectly still, spine tight, face unreadable. His eyes shot toward the small speaker nestled into the ceiling, then to the digital sign above the counters. He didn't need to look at the number above him to know which counter was labeled 3. It was his, the exact booth where he had been standing the whole time. The sound cut out, but its echo remained, sinking into the walls and into the minds of everyone listening. Brielle laughed, the sharp kind that doesn't come from humor, but from pure satisfaction. "Oops," she said, without looking at him. "Someone must be bored in IT." Wendell offered no comment, but he didn't look surprised either. Micah blinked repeatedly, unsure whether to sit or run. Kian stared at the speaker, his face still calm, still composed. But his stomach tightened with a burn he hadn't felt since middle school. The same deep knot of shame that came from being called out, not for what you'd done, but for what you were assumed to be. The moments that followed dragged like wet cement. A mother with 2 children stood from the seating area and slowly guided her kids to the opposite side of the lobby. An older man who had been tapping at his phone now stared openly at Kian, suspicion crawling across his features like a reflex. One of the tellers, further down, leaned in to her colleague and whispered something, causing them both to chuckle and glance his way. Wendell sighed dramatically, still refusing to look up from his monitor. "These systems act up sometimes," he said, as if trying to feign sympathy. "Nothing personal, man. Nothing personal." That phrase, too, felt like acid in Kian's ears. It always came after the wound, always right after the hit. And yet, despite everything, he didn't lash out. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't slam his hands on the counter or throw the clipboard or demand an apology. He simply adjusted his posture, placed the pen neatly back onto the counter, and waited, letting the silence speak louder than any outburst ever could. That's when the door behind the teller line swung open. Selma, branch manager, late 50s, tailored beige blazer, clip-on ID with her name and rank in bold font. She stepped forward, arms crossed, a Bluetooth earpiece blinking faintly in her right ear. Her presence immediately stiffened the atmosphere. The staff straightened. Even Kieran shifted slightly, and her eyes, hard, calculating, landed squarely on Kian. "So this is the disruption," she said, not even pretending to whisper. The room, already tense, dropped into an even sharper stillness. "Kid, this is a bank, not a youth shelter. If you're here trying to play entrepreneur, at least wear shoes that don't look like they've been run through a lawnmower." The laugh came from the far end of the room. A soft chuckle, then 2, then 4. No one outright burst into laughter. It wasn't a comedy club, but the mockery was there, thick in the air, unchallenged. Brielle clapped her keyboard like she was applauding the joke. Micah went pale. Kian didn't react. His chest rose once, slowly, then fell again. He blinked, steady, refusing to break. Selma stepped behind Wendell, glanced at the form on the counter, and waved a hand. "We're not processing this," she said. "Tell him to leave. If he has a real purpose here, he can come back with someone who knows what they're doing. Better yet, call ahead next time with someone who can speak for you." Kian didn't move, not yet, because he understood that any movement now, any sudden action, any burst of frustration, even standing up too fast, would be interpreted not as a reaction to mistreatment, but as aggression. He would not be seen as a wrong teenager. He would be framed as a threat. That, too, had been choreographed, and the next beat of the routine came quietly, wrapped in authority. The security guard, Kieran, approached without announcement, his shoes whispering across the tile. Kian didn't see him at first. He only felt the sudden, sharp tap on his left shoulder, just below the collarbone, not a gentle nudge, but a calculated prod, hard enough to jolt his posture. Kian turned his head slightly and saw him, tall, broad, silent. The bank logo on his uniform had started to peel at the edges. His expression was blank, but the message in his body language was unmistakable. He didn't speak because he didn't need to. His right hand rested directly on the clip of his radio. The other near his belt where a badge and security tool pouch sat, ready, accessible, ominous. He stared at Kian for 2 full seconds, then tilted his head toward the front entrance in a silent suggestion, or perhaps a demand. Kian didn't move. He didn't nod. He didn't challenge. He only stared back with a calm that was beginning to crack just beneath the surface. His breathing remained steady, but his pulse surged, heat rising along his neck and ears. He shifted slightly, intending only to sit up straighter, and that was all it took. Kieran's radio crackled, a small static burst that served as more threat than sound. The security guard didn't press the button, didn't say a word, but the subtle flex of his thumb across the device told Kian exactly what would happen if he failed to comply with the unspoken order. That tap, that presence, that silent hovering was no longer about protecting the bank or diffusing conflict. It was about coercion, about establishing dominance, about pushing Kian further down into a role he hadn't asked for, but was now forced to wear. The problem. Kian rose slowly from the bench, carefully keeping his hands visible, his form held lightly between his fingers. As he stood, his eyes scanned the space around him, registering every face that turned toward him. Customers looked away when he met their gaze, pretending disinterest. The bank staff didn't even bother to pretend. Wendell openly watched from his counter, a thin, satisfied smirk on his lips. Brielle whispered something to Micah, who looked visibly uncomfortable but said nothing. Selma was nowhere to be seen. She had made her strike and vanished back into her glass office, high above it all. Kian stepped forward, intending to simply reposition himself, maybe get closer to the information kiosk, so he could attempt to reschedule or at least print another queue ticket, though he knew it would likely be pointless. His movement was slow, deliberate, each step calculated to be non-threatening, yet internally, every muscle in his body was coiled tight with restraint. As his right foot shifted backward slightly to pivot, the sole of his sneaker struck plastic, smooth, curved, unstable. He tried to adjust, but his balance was already compromised. His foot slipped forward, the heel catching nothing but air as his body lurched backward. The clipboard in his hand flew sideways, the form separating in midair as Kian's arms flailed briefly, instinctively. But there was no time to catch himself. His back slammed hard against the floor with a dull thud, air rushing from his lungs as his head bounced once against the tile. A soft, mocking chorus of gasps and muffled laughter rippled through the lobby. Kian blinked against the sudden sting in his eyes, the overhead lights blurry for a second before coming back into focus. The wet floor sign, bright yellow, bold black letters, lay on its side behind him, clearly placed, not by accident but with intention. No spill, no water, no janitor in sight. Just the sign, flat and meaningless, waiting like a trap. Kieran remained standing above him, arms crossed now, no radio, no concern, no offer to help. His posture didn't shift, didn't break. He stared down at Kian like a warden watching an inmate trip over his own chains. No hand extended, no assistance offered, only the continued expectation that Kian would pick himself up, and fast. Kian didn't cry out. He didn't curse. He didn't scream. He sat up slowly, using only his own strength, one arm pushing off the tile, while the other gathered the scattered papers around him. His elbow ached. His wrist throbbed faintly. The back of his hoodie was slightly damp now from the cold floor. Still, no one moved to help. Not the nearby customers. Not the tellers. Not even Micah, whose eyes darted away the moment Kian glanced toward him. Kian stood, straightening his posture again, no longer to seem professional or confident, but simply to prove, to himself more than anyone, that he could still stand, that they hadn't succeeded. Not yet. He gathered the torn form, the bent clipboard, and walked back to the bench, every step measured, chest tight, vision narrowed. Kieran followed only with his eyes, not his feet. He'd delivered his warning. Mission complete. The physical pain was secondary now, background noise compared to the sting of having been laughed at, ignored, degraded, and finally tripped like a spectacle in the middle of a public place. But beyond all that, what haunted Kian most wasn't the abuse itself. It was how carefully it had been orchestrated, not a chaotic string of isolated incidents, but a pattern deliberate and unbroken, each action building on the last, like a twisted choreography of humiliation. Still, he refused to walk out. He couldn't. Not just because his job was unfinished, but because leaving would affirm what they were working so hard to prove, that he didn't belong there, that he couldn't hold his ground. And so he sat, wiped the dust from his pants, adjusted his hoodie, and opened the zipped compartment of his backpack to retrieve his secondary documentation, just in case they required further verification. If they wanted paperwork, he'd give them paperwork. He had every right to be there, and even if they wouldn't process his forms with integrity, he would continue to offer them with dignity. This time, instead of returning to Wendell or Brielle, Kian approached the far end of the service row where a clerk named Terrell stood behind the final booth. Terrell was tall, clean-shaven, and wore a headset, his face unreadable, a company smile pasted just beneath his disinterested eyes. As Kian stepped up to the counter, Terrell didn't greet him. He didn't ask how he could help. He simply stared, like someone waiting for a reason to not engage. Kian kept his voice steady. "I'd like a printed transaction verification form, please." "Blank is fine. I'll fill it out." Terrell blinked once, then reached beneath the desk and pulled a sheet from a drawer. He didn't check the printer. He didn't verify the request. He just handed over a single piece of paper without a word. Kian took it slowly, nodding once as thanks, but as he glanced down at the sheet, his stomach dropped. It wasn't the standard transaction form. It was blank, completely, fully blank. No header, no date stamp, no client section, no barcode, no watermark. Just plain white printer paper. Kian looked up. "I think this is just regular paper," he said cautiously. Terrell smirked and leaned forward slightly, his voice cold, deliberate. "It reflects your credit history," he said. Non-existent. For a moment, Kian didn't move. The words settled in, heavier than they should have. They weren't spoken loudly, but they rang with the finality of a slammed door. The statement was designed to hit beneath the surface, to call not just his presence, but his entire worth into question. Kian turned the page over once more, confirming it was indeed just scrap, then slowly slid it back across the counter. Terrell didn't take it. Instead, he stared down at the paper, and with a single fingertip pushed it toward the edge so that it fluttered off and landed face up on the floor. The message was clear. You don't belong here, and nothing you do will change that. Kian stepped back, again humiliated, again publicly dismissed. He crouched to pick up the paper, but before he could reach it, a sharp buzz sounded from the waiting area printer behind him. Someone had triggered a job through the internal system. As he turned his head, he noticed two more tellers at a nearby kiosk watching him, whispering, then laughing softly, covering their mouths, as if their joy was a secret that needed guarding. Kian retrieved the sheet, walked back toward his bench, and placed it gently in his folder, even though it served no purpose. His fingers trembled slightly, not with fear, but with the weight of restraint. He wanted to ask what they were gaining from this, how it made them feel powerful to target someone like him. Someone who hadn't even raised his voice, someone who had followed every rule. But he didn't ask because he knew the answer. It wasn't about rules. It was never about rules. It was about the story they told themselves, that they were the gatekeepers, and he was the intruder. He stood for a moment longer, bracing himself to move, adjusting the straps of his backpack as he slung it over one shoulder. He could feel a slight shift in the air behind him, a rustle of movement, something subtle but deliberate. As he began walking toward the interior ATM kiosk to double-check his documents, he felt a sudden lightness at the base of his hoodie, like fabric being tugged gently. He stopped, turned his head, but no one was behind him. A second later, a muffled laugh echoed from somewhere behind the customer service desk. He glanced at a reflective panel on the side of the ATM, just catching a glimpse of the back of his hoodie. His stomach tightened. There, stuck across the middle of the fabric, was a fluorescent label, big, rectangular, bright yellow with bold black letters. It read, "Fake client." He froze. The ATM's reflective surface wasn't perfect, but it was enough to make out the details. The adhesive label looked like it had been slapped on quickly, maybe seconds earlier. His eyes darted to the customer service desk, where Brielle and Wendell now stood together, pretending to review documents but clearly watching him. Brielle's lips twitched as if trying not to smile. Wendell's phone was angled just low enough to suggest he was filming or photographing him from behind. Kian's hands instinctively reached for the label, tearing it off quickly and shoving it into his pocket, but the damage had already been done. Other customers had seen it. One woman glanced away with awkward discomfort. Another man smirked as he tapped at his phone, possibly posting about the scene as it unfolded. No one said anything. No one intervened. The sticker had been a silent signal, a branding mark, a cruel joke passed off as prank but meant to degrade. No one in the building believed he belonged. No one intended to give him the opportunity to prove otherwise. He had become, in their eyes, a symbol of intrusion, a young black male in their gleaming white space, a disruption to their imagined order, a disruption they had collectively agreed to reject. Still, he hadn't moved. His instincts told him that retreat would not restore his dignity. It would only validate their narrative. So he stood there, silent but present, refusing to be erased any further. It didn't take long for Selma to return. The heavy glass door of her office swung open, and she emerged once more, her heels striking the floor like a metronome of judgment. This time she didn't walk with the calculated condescension of a supervisor making a point. This time she strode with the confidence of someone about to exercise authority, with no expectation of being challenged. She was flanked by Kieran, who now walked slightly ahead of her, his shoulders squared and his expression unreadable, the kind of blank professionalism that offered deniability while enabling aggression. Selma didn't slow down as she approached Kian. She didn't soften her voice. She didn't ask questions. She simply stopped 2 feet from him, hands clasped, and spoke as if addressing an unruly child in front of an audience that had already agreed to her version of the truth. "Mr. Maddox," she said, stressing his last name like it was a punchline, "we've given you more than enough time to conduct any legitimate business you might have had today." Her voice was loud enough to reach every corner of the lobby. People turned. Conversation stopped. Even the background music seemed quieter. "Unfortunately, we've had several customers report feeling unsafe due to your presence, and frankly, your refusal to comply with staff instructions has become a disruption to our operation." Kian blinked. Once. His lips parted slightly, a breath catching in his throat, but no sound came out. Selma continued, undeterred. "You are not being arrested. You are not being charged. But you are being asked formally to leave these premises immediately." The word unsafe lingered in the air like smoke. That one word had been weaponized countless times before against people who looked like him. It didn't matter that he hadn't raised his voice, hadn't made threats, hadn't done anything but follow the rules they had twisted around him. The accusation didn't require evidence. It only required perception, and the room was filled with people willing to see what Selma described. Kian stood still, arms relaxed at his sides, palms slightly out, every instinct in his body screaming at him to resist the injustice, to push back, to demand she explain what part of his behavior had triggered this false alarm. But logic no longer applied here. This wasn't about policy. This was about power. And they had it. Kieran stepped forward, placing himself between Kian and the rest of the bank. "Sir," he said quietly, "you're going to need to exit with me." There was no malice in his tone, but also no sympathy. Just procedure. Cold and final. Kian's breath hitched again, but he gave a single nod, barely perceptible. He bent slowly to pick up his folder and clipboard, his movements precise and calm, though his hands trembled just enough to betray the storm inside. As he stood, something flickered in his peripheral vision, a small movement from Wendell's booth. The man was leaning against the edge of the counter, one hand casually tucked into his pocket. When Kian turned to follow Kieran toward the exit, Wendell stepped forward, pulled a crumpled dollar bill from his wallet, and held it out like an offering. "Here you go, champ," he said with exaggerated cheer. "Go open a lemonade stand. Maybe you'll work your way up to a real bank one day." The mockery was loud enough to draw laughter from somewhere behind the loan officers' desks. Kian didn't look at him. He didn't reach for the dollar. He didn't stop walking. But every step he took alongside Kieran felt like the floor had grown heavier, as if gravity itself conspired to slow him down. His body burned with a heat that had nothing to do with shame and everything to do with restraint. The glass doors ahead loomed larger with each step, their metallic trim reflecting the distorted shapes of the room behind him, shapes he would never forget. As they neared the exit, Kieran finally spoke again, his voice lower now, almost personal. "You don't have to let them get to you," he said, without turning his head. Kian glanced at him sideways, unsure if the statement was meant to comfort or manipulate. Either way, he didn't respond. He simply crossed the threshold, and the doors slid open once more with the same mechanical hiss that had welcomed him into the building what felt like hours ago. Outside, the light was harsher, colder than before, or maybe it just felt that way now. Kieran didn't follow him past the door. He remained at the threshold, watching to ensure compliance, to confirm that the problem had been removed. Kian stood there on the sidewalk for a moment, just breathing. His hands clenched at his sides, folder gripped tightly under his arm, documents now creased and useless in their present state. The stares from inside continued for a few more seconds before the glass dimmed slightly and the automated door slid shut behind him. The sound of it closing felt like a final verdict. His mouth was dry, his throat tight. A bus passed behind him, horns blaring faintly in the distance. Life moving on as if nothing extraordinary had just happened. As if a 17-year-old with official authorization hadn't just been publicly ejected from a bank for doing absolutely nothing wrong. The shame settled over him like dust, invisible but suffocating. Every insult had been wrapped in customer service smiles. Every dismissal had been disguised as compliance. Every stare, every fake form, every whispered laugh, every action culminating in his ejection had been carried out not with fists or slurs, but with surgical precision, and that made it more dangerous. He looked down at the folder tucked beneath his arm. His grip tightened. A crease marked the corner now. The same folder he had presented with calm authority. The same documentation that had been torn, denied, mocked, and tossed aside as if it had no weight. But the truth was, it had more power than anyone inside that building understood. And now, standing in the cold morning light, Kian knew it was time to let that power speak for itself. He stepped away from the entrance, not in retreat, but in control, and moved to the edge of the sidewalk beneath the shade of a small concrete overhang that shielded the ATM vestibule. He placed his folder carefully on a narrow bench beside him and opened it with quiet purpose, sliding out a heavy white envelope sealed in embossed laminate. It bore no return address, but on the top right corner was a holographic seal, a federally issued insignia recognizable only to those trained to see it. He held the envelope in his palm for a moment, staring at the light bouncing off its surface, then slowly peeled back the seal and removed the contents. Inside was the full audit authorization letter, printed on layered security stock, complete with watermarks, 2 embedded chip tags, and the digital audit clearance credentials, a temporary assignment from the Bureau of Financial Compliance and Integrity, signed and activated 48 hours prior. Below, it was the assignment briefing, listing Nova Bank Branch 14B by name and location. Kian's name appeared at the center of the document, printed in bold just beneath the header. Field Auditor in Training Kian L. Maddox Authorization Tier 3, Accompanied Autonomy. He looked up just as a tall woman in business attire rounded the corner, her coffee in hand and a leather tote bag slung over her shoulder. She paused when she saw Kian standing there, her eyes scanning the envelope, then the folder beside him. She was in her mid-40s, African-American, sharp blazer, pressed slacks, her stride confident, but not rushed. Her face registered the scene before her with subtle precision. She caught the faint tremble in Kian's hand, the pressed tightness around his lips, the way he kept glancing at the sealed documents like they were his only tether to something real. She recognized the look. She had worn it herself, once. Without a word, she approached the bench, tilted her head, and took a closer look at the document in Kian's hands. "That's not a school assignment," she said flatly. Kian turned slightly toward her, surprised. She pointed to the emblem on the upper corner of the page. "That's a federal clearance. Tier 3, with accompanied autonomy. You're not a client. "You're an auditor." Kian nodded, unsure if she was questioning or confirming, but her tone left no doubt that she knew exactly what she was looking at. The woman blinked once, then turned toward the bank's entrance, her eyes narrowing slightly as the morning light shifted across the glass. "They kick you out," she said, her voice still quiet but edged with something sharper. Kian nodded again. She gave a slow exhale, then extended her hand. "Pamela Trask, Regional Executive, West Sector. Off duty, but not off code." He stared at her for half a second, then accepted the handshake. Her grip was strong, certain. No hesitation. "What happened inside?" she asked, her gaze fixed on the building. Kian handed her the audit assignment. "Everything that wasn't supposed to," he said. She read the top of the page, her eyes moving quickly but carefully. "This is active authorization," she said. "They should have checked the badge chip at the counter. You were supposed to be escorted to the branch supervisor within 5 minutes of arrival." She looked back up. "They didn't do any of that, did they?" Kian didn't need to answer. Pamela's jaw tightened. Without another word, she adjusted the strap of her bag and walked back toward the glass doors. They slid open automatically. She didn't wait to be greeted. Inside the lobby, Brielle was chatting at the counter with Wendell, both still chuckling over something they'd shared on his phone screen. Kieran stood nearby, arms folded again, now fully relaxed, clearly satisfied with the removal of what he perceived as the day's problem. Pamela's entrance changed the air immediately. Wendell noticed first, his smirk dropping when he registered her ID tag, still clipped to the inner lining of her blazer. He stood straighter, clearing his throat. "Good morning, ma'am. How can we help?" But Pamela didn't stop. She walked directly to the nearest kiosk and tapped on the service tablet, selecting the branch staff directory and pulling up Selma's name and internal extension. Without waiting for a response, she turned toward Kieran. "Fetch your branch manager immediately," she said. "Now." Kieran hesitated for half a second too long. Pamela's stare locked onto him like a drill. "Unless you'd like to be the next person outside explaining to federal oversight why an auditor was ejected from a public service institution during an active compliance review, I suggest you move." The room went silent. Customers glanced up from their phones. Brielle's expression shifted from amusement to confusion. Wendell stepped back, trying to look busy, but it was too late. Selma emerged seconds later, adjusting her blazer as she walked briskly toward the center of the lobby. Her face showed the beginnings of concern, but she still wore that managerial armor of forced calm. Kian stepped inside, the soft green glow of the door's scanning panel reflecting faintly on his face, as his federal ID card had granted him privileged access that had been cruelly denied just moments before at the customer service counter. The room smelled faintly of ozone and recycled air, a stark contrast to the polished lobby he had just left behind, now transformed from a stage of public humiliation into the very nerve center of accountability. Kian allowed himself a brief moment to collect his thoughts, his fingers tightening around the edge of his folder as he scanned the walls filled with real-time footage. Video clips of himself being ignored, scorned, tripped, and mocked. Timestamps overlaid to each clip, all tied to names, and employee ID numbers visible beneath the windows of each camera feed. His own face appeared on one screen, eyes steady but lips pressed tight, moments before the wet floor sign had sent him crashing to the ground. Another showed Selma barking orders in the lobby, her expression icy as she demanded his removal. Wendell's sneer was frozen on yet another, caught mid-mockery as he tossed the torn paperwork aside. The streams weren't edited. They were raw, unfiltered, a digital diary of discrimination. And Kian was the subject, the victim, the witness. Without a word, the door behind him clicked open again, and Pamela Trask entered, followed by two other senior members of the regional oversight team, an older man with steel gray hair and a woman whose sharp eyes missed nothing. They carried tablets and notepads, and their presence immediately changed the energy in the room. Pamela nodded toward the screens. "This is what we need," she said softly, eyes locked on the streams. "We have a full record, the entire branch's performance under surveillance, and we have a clear chain of incidents." She turned to Kian. "You did exactly what we trained you to do. Document, observe, and collect." Kian nodded slowly. He hadn't said much since stepping into the room, but now, the burden he had carried so long felt less isolating. Here, his experience mattered. His voice was amplified by the data, by the unarguable facts playing out on the screens. The team began to work swiftly, pulling up detailed employee profiles, cross-referencing time logs with the video evidence, and marking key moments with digital flags. Pamela tapped on a feed showing Kieran's rigid posture as he hovered near the entrance, then zoomed in on the label stuck to Kian's back and the fake announcement broadcast over the intercom. "This is systemic," she said, a note of anger barely contained beneath her professional tone. "It's coordinated, deliberate, and blatant." The senior analyst across the room added, "These behaviors violate every section of the Employee Code of Conduct. We're looking at discrimination, obstruction of federal oversight, and abuse of authority." Kian watched as his own humiliation was deconstructed piece by piece. The moments of pain and injustice no longer isolated, but interconnected threads in a pattern of misconduct that had been ignored for far too long. But alongside the raw footage and cold data was something new, a sense of vindication growing inside him. This room, these people, were here to right the wrongs, to bring truth to light where the bank's lobby had been full of silence and cruelty. He let out a slow breath, eyes scanning the room one last time before focusing on the terminal displaying a live chat feed between the regional team and the bank's corporate compliance division. Requests for immediate suspension of implicated employees had been sent, and a formal investigation was being activated. The screen flashed with a message confirming the lockdown of all staff access badges from the branch until further notice. Pamela looked at Kian again. "Your courage to stay, despite everything, is what made this possible. The data alone wouldn't have carried the same weight without your presence on the ground." Her words hung in the air like a promise, a recognition of all he had endured. Kian nodded, feeling the weight of months of preparation, hours of suppressed anger, and moments of acute humiliation transform into something greater, a force for change. Outside the operations room, the regional team coordinated their next steps. Calls were being made, alerts sent, and legal counsel brought in to handle the ramifications. The branch would face consequences. Employees would be held accountable. Procedures would be overhauled. And all because a 17-year-old refused to be silenced, refused to disappear into the system's cracks. The morning's battles had shifted from public shame to private power, from forced ejection to official command. And Kian was at the center of it all, not as a victim, but as an agent of justice. The reverberations of the audit struck Nova Bank with the weight of a storm unleashed. Within hours of the internal team confirming the systematic misconduct, the first wave of disciplinary actions rolled out with a precision that surprised even the most seasoned investigators. At the center of the upheaval were the key players who had orchestrated or abetted the mistreatment of Kian Maddox. Brielle, the gatekeeper of disdain; Wendell, the enforcer of bureaucratic delays; Selma, the branch manager who had wielded power like a weapon; and Kieran, the security officer who had turned silent intimidation into an art form. All received formal notices of suspension pending further investigation. Their employee access badges, once symbols of authority, were remotely deactivated within minutes, locking them out of every system and building on Nova Bank's network. Alongside the suspensions came placement on the bank's compliance blacklist, an internal register reserved for those found guilty of violating the company's code of ethics, with the potential to bar them from employment across all affiliated financial institutions. The news cascaded quickly throughout the branch, casting a chilling pall over the once bustling hub. The remaining staff, some complicit and others shocked, watched in silence as their colleagues were stripped of power and responsibility. The hum of whispered conversations and guarded glances filled the air, a collective reckoning settling over the team. At the executive level, the fallout prompted an immediate temporary closure of the branch. A public statement was drafted with care but candor. Nova Bank acknowledged the findings of discrimination and misconduct, expressed regret to the affected client, and pledged a thorough review of policies, training programs, and leadership accountability. Customers with pending transactions were contacted personally, reassured that alternative arrangements would be made, and invited to follow updates via the bank's official channels. The closure sent ripples through the local community, where patrons had unknowingly been part of a system that allowed such behavior to fester unchecked. Local news outlets picked up the story, highlighting the systemic discrimination faced by a young auditor performing his duty. Headlines splashed across digital screens and printed pages, with Novabank's public image teetering on the edge of crisis. Amid the media storm, Kian remained composed. He spent hours in the operations room alongside Pamela Trask and the regional audit team, reviewing footage, refining reports, and preparing testimony for the upcoming internal hearings. He answered questions with precision, recalling incidents with clarity despite the emotional weight they carried. His resilience in the face of adversity inspired the team, strengthening their resolve to see justice done. Kian's presence transformed from that of a victim to a key witness and catalyst for change within the organization. His story became emblematic of a broader cultural failure, and his role in exposing it turned into a symbol of hope for those demanding accountability. The disciplinary process extended beyond mere suspensions. Novabank's compliance department launched an exhaustive investigation, examining hiring practices, employee training protocols, and leadership oversight. Independent consultants were brought in to audit company culture. Employee surveys were conducted anonymously, and mandatory sensitivity and ethics training sessions were scheduled for all branches nationwide. The bank committed to transparency, promising quarterly updates on progress and the implementation of new standards designed to prevent future abuses. The reverberations of Kian's audit forced the institution to confront uncomfortable truths and embark on a long road to repair its fractured trust with clients and employees alike. Internally, the staff directly implicated faced not only professional consequences, but personal reckonings. Brielle, who had once wielded her position with arrogance, found herself grappling with the sudden loss of status and public scrutiny. Wendell's previously confident demeanor faded under the weight of investigation and legal counsel. Selma's tenure as branch manager ended abruptly, replaced by a new leadership team charged with rebuilding a culture of respect and integrity. Kieran's security role was suspended pending a full review of his conduct and adherence to federal and company policies. These personnel changes sent a clear message throughout Novabank. Discrimination and misconduct would no longer be tolerated or swept under the rug. Outside the walls of Novabank, Kian's courage ignited conversations about systemic racism, power abuse, and the necessity of vigilant oversight within financial institutions. His story was shared widely on social media, discussed on news panels, and cited in advocacy forums as an example of how individuals, even young and underestimated ones, could challenge entrenched systems and force accountability. Grassroots organizations began to use his case as a rallying point for broader reforms in banking practices and workplace equity, connecting his experience to a larger movement toward social justice. The day dawned with a quiet stillness that belied the storm of change brewing inside Novabank's once fractured walls. The lobby, freshly cleaned and freshly painted, welcomed a trickle of customers cautious but hopeful, while the large digital screen above the main entrance flickered to life and began displaying a curated montage of the very footage that had sparked the institution's reckoning. The silent clips showed Kian Maddox's journey, from the wary steps into the lobby, through the moments of silent scorn, the orchestrated obstructions, the humiliations, and finally the relentless dignity with which he had endured them all. The crowd gathered silent but attentive, faces reflecting a collective reckoning as the reality of systemic failure was brought into vivid light. The footage wasn't accompanied by narration or music. It spoke purely through its stark honesty, compelling viewers to witness the truth without filter or distraction. Among those watching were longtime customers who had once trusted the bank implicitly, employees who had felt the weight of unspoken rules and biased practices, and newcomers who hoped the institution's promise of fairness was more than just words. There was discomfort, yes. Some looked away, others exchanged glances. Yet beneath the unease lay a shared resolve that the era of silent complicity was over. In the weeks since the audit's revelations, Nova Bank had taken deliberate steps to repair not only its reputation, but the very culture that had permitted prejudice to thrive. The executive leadership had pledged sweeping reforms, mandatory diversity and ethics training, anonymous reporting systems, community advisory panels, and transparent disciplinary processes. The interim regional director, Pamela Trask, was visibly present, often walking the floors, engaging with staff and customers, listening and learning in real time. The bank had reopened with a clear message. Change was not only necessary, it was underway. Kian, standing just outside the branch's entrance, watched the scene unfold with a mixture of solemnity and hope. He bore the scars of the morning's battles, not only physical but emotional, but his resolve had only grown stronger. His role had shifted dramatically, from silent observer to key actor in an institutional transformation. He carried with him no illusions about the ease of change, but a steadfast belief that truth and persistence could move mountains. The badge clipped to his jacket, once ignored or mocked, now symbolized a new beginning, a commitment to accountability and justice that transcended individual roles and reputations. As he turned away from the entrance, Kian's gaze fell upon a newly installed marble statue near the lobby, a monument to the bank's founder, a man from a very different time, whose own legacy had been one of exclusion and hierarchy. Beneath the statue, a fresh bronze plaque caught the light. This branch was restructured by a generation that refuses to stay silent. The words struck a chord deep within Kian's heart, a testament not just to the struggle he had endured, but to the power of collective action and the unyielding courage to confront injustice. It was a reminder that history was not fixed. It could be rewritten by those who refused to accept silence. The message extended beyond the walls of Nova Bank. Kian's story had ignited conversations in communities across the country about systemic racism, institutional accountability, and the power of youth to drive change. Advocacy groups hailed the audit as a landmark victory and called for similar transparency in other industries and organizations. Social media buzzed with discussions, shares, and calls for action. Kian became a reluctant symbol, a face of resilience that many looked to for inspiration. But he remained grounded, knowing that the fight was far from over, that one audit was a beginning, not an end. Behind the scenes, the bank continued its work. Policies were rewritten, training programs expanded, and leadership reshuffled. Nova Bank partnered with local organizations to support financial literacy and inclusion, creating pathways for underrepresented communities to access resources once denied to them. Employees who had formerly been complicit in the toxic culture faced consequences, but many also chose to engage in restorative processes, recognizing the need for growth and change. The institution's transformation became a case study for corporate responsibility, a model for how accountability could be woven into the fabric of business practices. For Kian, the journey was deeply personal. He returned to his studies with renewed purpose, continuing his work as a federal auditor with an unshakable commitment to equity. His experiences fueled a passion to ensure that no one else would endure what he had faced silently for so long. He spoke at community events, collaborated with advocacy groups, and mentored other young people navigating systems that were not always designed for them. His story became a beacon, proof that courage, when combined with evidence and perseverance, could dismantle injustice and build a future where dignity was a right, not a privilege. In the end, the restructuring of Nova Bank's branch was more than a corporate response to scandal. It was a collective awakening, a recognition that the silence that had allowed discrimination to fester must be broken, a celebration of those who refused to be invisible, who spoke out despite the risks, and who demanded a world where respect and fairness were not exceptions, but the rule. And as Kian walked away from the marble statue, his footsteps steady and sure, he carried with him not just the burden of the past, but the promise of a better tomorrow. The end. If you found this story compelling, please take a moment to like and subscribe so you won't miss the next chapter. We'd love to hear your thoughts. What did you think of the plot twists and the journey of Kian Maddox? Where are you watching from? Share your location and your impressions in the comments below. Your feedback means a lot, and helps us bring more powerful stories your way.